Welcome to Voices of the Community, which explores critical issues facing Northern California communities. We introduce you to the voices of community thought leaders and change makers who are working on solutions that face our fellow individual community members, neighborhoods, cities, and our region. This is George Koster, your host. This episode is part of our series exploring COVID-19's impact on nonprofits and small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area. Back in April of 2020, when we decided to create this ongoing series on COVID-19's impact, first on nonprofits and then on small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area, we, like you, had no idea how long the pandemic would go on and what the health and economic impact would be in our community. With vaccinations increasing, COVID-19 cases and deaths decreasing, we're now moving into the summer of 2021 with the reopening of the economy and all of the uncertainty of our ever-changing indoor and outdoor, vaccinated and unvaccinated protocols, and the politics that will drive how we all come back together as a unified or fractured community. We will continue to shine a spotlight on the nonprofits and small businesses that make up the fabric of our community, along with the founders and staff who are struggling to deal with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on their operations, services, and sustainability until we can all get to the other side of the pandemic. Along the way, we will also share with you all the amazing solutions that our nonprofits, small businesses, foundations, and government leaders are working on to help us all get to the other side of the pandemic and come together to rebuild our communities with more economic, social, and environmental equality.
We didn't know what was going to happen. So we were some of the first to get Moscone online and up and running, right? We brought equipment out there. We brought everything, right? We brought the garage. We emptied the garage. And then nothing, right? And then, for good reason, we hunkered down. We sheltered in place. We didn't go anywhere. We didn't do anything. And hopefully that will have saved more people and, saved the economy as well. But we did the thing we needed to do. We're getting through it. I'm reluctant to say we're through it, but we're getting through it. We know what to do now. But looking back, of the things we know how to do, of the things we learned over the last year, how can we apply them to other aspects of the community? I think particularly and acutely about wildfire season, right? That was another thing that really affected us as Californians, as a community.
This is the president of the San Francisco Radio Club, Greg Albright. The San Francisco Radio Club was formed in 1909 by a handful of radio enthusiasts with the objective of exchanging messages over the air. We wanted to host the San Francisco Radio Club on the show because it is another one of our wonderful nonprofits that are supporting our community through providing emergency communication services, as well as educating and training community members in amateur radio and emergency mesh operations. I'm joined remotely by Greg Albright, the president of the San Francisco Radio Club. Thanks for being here, Greg.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I love the San Francisco Radio Club. I'm an old-time radio person myself. I never got into ham per se, but I would love it if you could just provide the audience a little background on the San Francisco Radio Club, which is over 100 years old now, and then your work inside of the emergency disaster communications. You've got emergency mesh Wi-Fi that you're doing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start with the Radio Club. So the San Francisco Radio Club is over 100 years old. Ironically, we predate the existence of there being any idea of a nonprofit within the federal IRS. So that complicates things a little bit. So what we provide is a community for folks who are interested in communications overall, while the club itself is primarily focused on amateur radio and ham radio and sort of the pillars of that hobby. We certainly welcome anyone interested in communications, radio communication, science, education, emergency and disaster response, and public service that might stem from that. We have periodic club meetings, and we have a variety of topics that we cover in those club meetings. We have radio systems that amateurs and interested folks can use to communicate with each other. We have a very active online community, both with a Slack and a mailing list. And when we put on an event like Field Day, which gets us to exercise some of our emergency and disaster communications capabilities, and we participate in public service events. Granted, there haven't been any over the past year. Things like marathons, walkathons, bike events, other large-scale events where group communication and coordination either tends to be a challenge or might require infrastructure beyond what might exist in the steady state. And for us as hams, that lets us go out and, exercise our hobby in real world scenarios.
And then you also interface with the city emergency communications department, it sounds like, as well.
That's correct. So the San Francisco Radio Club in and of itself is a nonprofit entity, wholly independent of any government agency. But within our ranks, we have a lot of members who participate in a city agency called ACS, Auxiliary Communications. And that entity is mirrored in a lot of other communities around California and around the country. But what that is it allows us as amateur radio operators to provide services to served agencies. So if we imagine all of the services that the city and county of San Francisco provides, fire, police, animal control, parks and recreation, those are groups that rely on communications, again, both in their steady state and even more so under duress, right? When they're responding to emergencies and disasters. And that's our specialty as hams, right? Solving communications problems and providing communication solutions, if you want to spin it the other way. The ACS is a vetted group of radio volunteers who participate and serve for the city and county of San Francisco.
Thank you. Good overview. And then how has COVID-19 impacted the club's kind of operation and your ability, to your point, to help serve the community?
I myself have been a ham for a number of years, since before I could drive a car, right? But my participation as an officer of the club really only spans over the last year. Prior to that, I was the board of directors of the club. So I can only speak to my intimate experience with trying to run the club during COVID. But prior to that, we would have monthly meetings where we would get together. We typically would meet at the SFVA, which is on the western part of the city, which in hindsight provided a lot of challenges for folks, right? It was hard on a Friday evening to schlep all the way across the city to the VA for a meeting, at 6 or 7 o'clock. So an interesting turn for the club was we found that participation actually increased when we went virtual. There were a lot more people able to participate on a Friday evening via Zoom or Hangouts or one of the online platforms than we could, manifest at the VA on a Friday night. And it also got us a bigger diversity of speakers. We had everyone talking about everything from how rockets explode to, how to find a lost hiker in the woods, right? And the gamut, right? So every topic of interest sort of adjacent to the hobby and adjacent to the interest of the hobby. The downside, of course, has been there were a lot of events that were better facilitated by being there in person. Field Day is a good example. Field Day is an annual event put on by an organization called ARRL, Amateur Radio Relay League or American Radio Relay League. So it's a nationwide organization where the last weekend of June, they encourage groups to go out and exercise their emergency communications capabilities, right? Operate from a park. Bring a battery, bring solar power, bring a generator, drag your equipment out of your house. And we didn't get to do that last year. Luckily this year, both because the state has been opening up a little bit and because we have a new interest from one of our host agencies, we were invited to participate at their facility this year. We did it for one day, just during the day. There was no overnight or anything. We didn't provide any food this year, but we had a pretty good turnout. And I think it was because people were interested both in getting back out and seeing faces, but also, for a lot of us, we were sitting on our hands for most of last year, right? There wasn't a whole lot. It was a weird disaster. It wasn't the kinds of disaster we're typically trained for. So we were kind of powerless for most of the year. So I think it was good for people to get out and sort of flex those muscles, if you will.
So you just did Field Day, a week or so ago. And then what are you and the club doing as we are reopening? How is the club coming back together with the ability to actually be in person?
I would say it's a mixed bag. I'm trying to be sensitive to how I describe the community, but the community of hams tends to trend older, which means that there tend to be a lot of folks that are more prone to illness or more prone to communicable diseases. And I found that those folks in the community, while we want to be engaged with everyone, of course, we're continuing trying to expand the community that participates. They're more cautious, right? There's a lot more for them to lose. And for me, I have to be aware of the fact that they have a corpus of knowledge, both folk knowledge and tacit knowledge that we don't want to lose, right? So I don't want to ever put that community in danger because we decide to sort of, in a cavalier way, push forward to being back together because we believe it's safe to be back together. Like, not everyone can be back together that way, but how do we keep those folks engaged and participating? So that's been a challenge. I'm hoping that barring any upspurs and any variants in COVID, that we'll be able to start getting back together in person for our regular monthly meetings. We may do it in a hybrid manner, which presents its own challenges, but I've been in enough AV clubs that I know how that goes. So it's a challenge. I would say it's probably more challenging now than it was before, right? Having to balance the desire of some folks to get back together because they believe it's safe or they're in a point in their life where it's safe for them. And folks who can't, how do we keep both of those groups engaged in this hobby and in this club?
I think the message that I've taken away from many interviews this last 14 plus months is it seems like Zoom or any virtual space has really expanded the audience of so many organizations. And it sounds like it also did that for the San Francisco Radio Club.
Yeah, it has. One thing I've tried to reiterate with the club is just because it says the San Francisco Radio Club doesn't mean we're limited to San Francisco. We invite participation from anyone. Even if you're not necessarily a ham radio operator, right? There's things in this hobby that anyone can take away. You may not be interested in the same things that everyone else is. Personally, I'm not very good at talking on the radio, but there's a lot of digital modes where computer to computer contact is applicable here. There's other folks that, do everything from flying high altitude balloons with gamma ray detectors in them to long distance ocean buoys, right? We want everyone. We want everyone to participate. That's one. And I think the other is, this hobby trends a certain way. There's a certain demographic that has been attracted to this hobby classically, either because of, the folks that existed in the hobby itself or because of the types of outreach we were doing at the time. And it's not really representative of the larger community, especially the community we want to serve with public service and disaster response. What model fits in that allows additional people to participate in this hobby? And how do we fulfill that? We've looked at everything from, should we start tabling farmers markets, right? I was even pushing to hold field day in McLaren Park, which is the southeastern part of the city, because we tend to do a lot of stuff up here in the Richmond or the western part of the city. I'm like, well, there's an entire community over there that we're leaving out by having everything over here. No, I don't want to schlep. I wouldn't drive over here if I lived over there, especially on a Saturday. It's a challenge. It's definitely a challenge. I'm not going to say it's easy. If someone were starting from zero, I'd be like, wait a little bit. If this was the type of job that they wanted, or if this was the role that they wanted, I'd be like, there's a lot.
Over 100 and some odd years, what would you say has been the biggest impact of the San Francisco Radio Club here in San Francisco or the San Francisco Bay Area?
I don't like the word miracle, but a miracle happens, right? We do something and it's astonishing. There's a thing that happens and people ask, who knew to do that? How did that happen? Oh, it was a ham, right? Someone just, messing around and finding out. Yeah, I can't cite any specific examples because again, right, we have a club historian, Bart Lee, who keeps excellent records of these things. And if we look at the history of the Bay Area generally, starting from the Spanish coming to the Bay, all the way up through the Gold Rush, through World War II, and everything that's happened since then, I think hams have played a role, either directly or as members of the community, that have facilitated that. We are of the community and we are here to serve the community. The FCC wouldn't continue to have the amateur radio service, like Part 97 service, if that weren't true. And I think a lot of hams take that to heart. And you get to a point in the hobby where you start reflecting on what's in it for you and what's in it for everyone else. And I think that inflection point is really important. And I think as a club, that's what I'd like us to start focusing on, is not just how are we serving ourselves and how are we serving the amateur radio community, but what is amateur radio doing for the broader community? COVID, again, exercised a lot of our ability to coordinate and communicate, which is a thing we do, but that's waning. What are the challenges within California generally, and how can we be there? How would you be a force multiplier for the community going forward?
So how can folks who are listening to our show today help the San Francisco Radio Club? How can they get engaged, membership, or find out more about it or make donations?
So if you're already a ham, if you're already an amateur radio operator, we have a couple of radio repeaters that you can program into your radio and just start communicating with people today. If you're interested in the hobby, you could visit our website, sfarc.org, or just search for San Francisco Radio Club. There's no cost to participate in our events. There's no cost to participate in our online forums like Slack and our mailing list. There's no cost to participate in our events. There's no cost to participate in Field Day. We welcome the public there. We used to hold licensing exams. There are now other groups in the Bay Area who've sort of picked up that ball and ran with it. But it's relatively inexpensive to get started if you want to get a license. I think $35 is the starting fee for that. But once you have that, it opens in this entire world of the hobby, right? Everything from voice communications, bouncing signals off the moon, talking to the International Space Station, high altitude balloons and everything in between, right? Space to nuts, I guess you could say. We have monthly meetings on Zoom today, which I believe are the third Friday of the month. That's calendared on our website. And then I would just say that if you're interested at all, join our Slack or join our mailing list. There's tons of people there to ask questions, guide you along your way.
Greg, could you share with the audience one of your favorite stories, if you will, or moments of participating in the radio club or your work inside of the emergency disaster communications?
A moment that I realized we could really change the community was we have a project we're working on So I haven't really told this story other than in person, and I've been wanting to sort of get it on the record because it's what precipitated this project. So separately from the Radio Club and separately from ACS, there's a project we've stood up called the San Francisco Wireless Emergency Mesh. It's primarily based in amateur radio, so it fits into both of those buckets. But a couple years ago, I was going to bed and I made the mistake of looking at my phone one more time right before I went to bed. And I saw someone post saying that they were evacuating Napa, and just a profound thing to hear. It'd be like they're evacuating Daly City. And I'm like, what? I could imagine the scale of that. I'm like, that's weird. What's going on in Napa? Right? Like if I were to say that to you now, you'd be like, what's going on in Napa? Right? We don't know what's going on. And then I looked through social media a little bit more, and someone in the city in San Francisco here said, my house smells like a campfire. And I'm like, that's weird. I don't smell anything. I went up to go to the bathroom, walk into the hallway at my house, and I'm like, my house smells like a camp. Is there a bonfire in my backyard? And that was the first time I remember smelling smoke in San Francisco. Other than I live by the beach. I smell the bonfires there, but like it was strong, right? It was like I was camping. It was unusual. In the 22 years I've been living here, I've never experienced that before. It sounds naive, of course, now because we've lived through it several times, but at the time, so it seemed profound. So I went to bed, woke up the next morning, turned on the radio. Someone from the local FM radio station had gone up to Napa, gone up to a hospital up there, and they were interviewing someone at the hospital. And they said, sir, ma'am, why are you at the hospital? Are you injured? And they said, no, I was at home and I heard some rumblings of something happening in the neighborhood. And I tried to get online on social media to find out what was happening, and I couldn't get online. So I went to the hospital, and I'm like, wow, there's a lot to unpack from that, right? Like whether or not you think social media was the right place for them to go for that information, that was their instinct, right? They needed information. They didn't turn on their AM, FM radio. They didn't turn on the TV. They didn't phone a friend. They went online. They went to social media. And presumably they went to the hospital either because the hospital would know what was up or because they were treating the hospital like a cafe. They'll have internet there, right? And I reflected back on like my decades of doing emergency and disaster communications. I would consider myself a specialist at this point, I guess. And I'm like, oh man, we failed. We've totally failed, right? When we think of disaster and emergency communications, we revert to Marconi era technology, right? We're like, cool, we'll get on a walkie-talkie or two-way radio. Maybe we'll use packet radio, which is, dial-up speed to send a message. But that's the limit of the capabilities that we bring. Whereas the person on the street, the layperson, right, if you will, right, their default is to go online to get information. As a medic, we'd call it like your psychomotor action. That's just what you default to. I'm like, there's a gap there. How do we fill this gap? Right. How do we update amateur radio and disaster and emergency communications for the 21st century? I think it was 2017, right? It's 2021. Why can't I just send an email? So that's what precipitated the San Francisco Wireless Emergency Mesh project. We needed to do better. We needed to update the capabilities we were bringing. It just so happened that the technology that we could use for that project was relatively inexpensive. The bar had been kind of lowered on both the cost of the equipment and the ease of making that equipment work the way we wanted it to with ham radio. And it just took off. We found a lot of organizations that were just getting rid of old equipment. They were cycling out their older equipment, and it was perfect for us. So, I would fill my car up with pallets of gear, bring it home, literally scrub it off in my sink, plug it into my computer, put some software on it, and then just give it out to people. I'd be like, hey, do you have roof access? Can you see anything? Here, take it. Next time you need an emergency communications capability, start with the radio, start with your walkie-talkie. But when you get to the point when you're reading a list over your walkie-talkie, just send an email. Just turn on this mesh, connect it to another, and send an email. It's 2021. Right. We got to catch up with everyone else. We should be leading the pack. We should be leading on innovation, not trailing. And that's how the mesh got started. It grew and grew. We attracted a lot of attention from agencies and organizations. The last year kind of sucked, right? There wasn't a lot for us to do. And we were trying to caution people to stay home and stay safe. But we were able to secure a grant to expand the capabilities of the network. And while it sounds weird to say, like, I'm really looking forward to how we can apply some of this innovation this year for disaster and emergency response within the state of California and within the Bay Area specifically.
Well, sadly, I think we're all going to be smelling a lot of campfires in our homes, given the way that the summer's going. So to that point, Greg, how can folks, if they've got some equipment, they want to donate, or they want to make a donation to the mesh, or they want to participate in the San Francisco Emergency Mesh, how can they do that?
San Francisco Wireless Emergency Mesh is also a nonprofit. We accept donations, both of equipment and, in-kind donations and monetary donations. And through SFOM, those are tax deductible. I would say the cost of equipment for building out this capability is really negligible. It's not a barrier. The biggest barrier is sites, having places to put things, buildings, towers, really anywhere, right? The benefit of it being the way it is, it doesn't require licensed infrastructure. It doesn't require a contractor to come out and run power lines. It's all low voltage. It's Ethernet. It's what you would use in your house, which I think has made it attractive to some people, right? It's not any more sophisticated than hooking up a cable modem. But once it's there, even if you don't use it yourself, it's providing a service to the community that doesn't exist today, right? So next time, the city has a group called NERT, Neighborhood Emergency Response Team. That is a group that could benefit from this capability. Other cities around the Bay Area have similar groups, CORE and CERT and all of these things. Again, today, they constrain themselves to two-way voice radio. And what we're saying is, hey, next time you need to read a list, don't read it over the radio, send an email, right? Don't describe the building that collapsed. Take a picture of it. Send a picture, right? Make a phone call. Other capabilities we're looking at adding are things like wildfire spotting cameras, remote telemetry, and air quality sensors, things like that, mobile deployable field kits, all of those things. So the best way to participate is if you know of a high site that would be willing to host one of our nodes, very small piece of equipment, let us know. Or start an introduction or start the conversation yourself. See how interested different organizations might be in hosting this capability. You know what it's for, right? It's for the community. We're trying to serve the community. We all live here. How are we going to serve our community going forward?
And then final question, Greg, what do you think are some of the positive things that could come out of the pandemic to support the increase of emergency disaster communications services like HAM and the club itself?
I think for the last year, a lot of us have been sitting on our hands. I don't mean that in a negative way, like not deliberately, but there wasn't a lot we could do, right? Early on in the pandemic, ACS coordinated setting up the Auxiliary Communication Service, the city's amateur radio group, of which a lot of SF Radio Club folks are participating, myself included. We stood up. We looked at it like a disaster, like a natural disaster, right? Cool. We're going to roll out all of our emergency communications capabilities. We stood up the Moscone Operations Center. We were at the EOC, every day, getting stuff ready, deploying. We didn't know what was going to happen. So we were some of the first to get Moscone online and up and running, right? We brought equipment out there. We brought everything, right? We brought the garage. We emptied the garage. And then nothing, right? And then, for good reason, we hunkered down. We sheltered in place. We didn't go anywhere. We didn't do anything. And hopefully that will have saved more people and, saved the economy as well. But we did the thing we needed to do. We're getting through it. I'm reluctant to say we're through it, but we're getting through it. We know what to do now. But looking back, of the things we know how to do, of the things we learned over the last year, how can we apply them to other aspects of the community? I think particularly and acutely about wildfire season, right? That was another thing that really affected us as Californians, as a community. We're in San Francisco. We're somewhat isolated from the effects of that as far as physical destruction goes, but it affected our health, right? I remember the Orange Day. It affected our children's health. It affected our community health. And all you have to do is drive 30 minutes north and you can see the destruction. To me, right, that mirrors the destruction you saw in South Florida after the hurricanes, right? Literal physical communities are gone, right? And people lost their lives. What role do we as communicators have to play in that? And how can we assist? And I think this year, what we need to look at is, and if you'll excuse sort of the pop psychology, the Gladwell-esque terms, but how can we communicate good information, right? How can we be the maven, I guess Gladwell will call it, of good information? If you negate the hyperbole around fake information over the last year, cool. You're a communicator. Your specialty is to solve communications problems. How do you solve the bad information communications problem? Or to, again, flip it the positive way, how can you be a multiplier for good information? How can you share evacuation information? You know how to listen for that information. You have radios and some people have scanners. You hear it. Cool. How can you reproduce that in the community? How can you help your neighbors? They might not have the same ability to intercept that information that you have. How can you assist them, especially during power shutoffs? That's our cup of tea. Power's out, hams are awake, right? We're ready to roll. Cool, that's going to happen again. The person who has their power off, their only way of receiving information might be online, might be social media. They might not get the evacuation warning. If you know about it, help spread that in your community, right? Be a conduit for good information in your community. I think that's how we're going to make a change this year. I hope that's the power we're going to bring this year.
Thanks, Greg. That was great. I love the image of multiplier of factual, positive, informative information for folks. Thank you, Greg, for sharing both the San Francisco Radio Club's work and emergency and disaster communications today. We'll make sure that listeners have your contact information, website, and social media so they can get engaged in the club and your upcoming events. Please stay safe and healthy as we work our way through this very strange pseudo-normalcy.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for this episode of Voices of the Community. You've been listening to the voice of the president of the San Francisco Radio Club, Greg Albright. To find out more about the San Francisco Radio Club programs, as well as getting engaged as a member, please go to sfarc.org. Greg had mentioned the term ham or hams. The actual meaning of ham is taken from the three pioneers that helped to create what has become our global radio system. The letter H stands for Hertz, from Heinrich Hertz, who helped to develop the theory of electromagnetic waves. The letter A stands for Armstrong, from Edward Howard Armstrong, who was successful in inventing FM, or frequency modulation. And the letter M stands for Marconi, from Guglielmo Marconi, who was the first person to transmit radio signals across the Atlantic Ocean in 1901. Please tune in to KSFP 102.5 FM and next week's show on July 15th at 8:30 a.m., where we share the voices from Miracle Messages about their Miracle Money pilot program to help bring stability to our unhoused community members through direct cash transfers and its impact. We hope that you enjoyed the insights, points of view, and personal stories from the voices of changemakers and their nonprofits and small businesses featured in this series. To find out more and get engaged with the nonprofits, small businesses, and staff members featured in the series, please go to my website, georgecoster.com, and click on Voices of the Community to find links to the extended versions of these interviews and to listen to the entire series. After listening to these stories, we hope that you will consider making a donation and volunteering to provide a hand up to your fellow community members. I want to thank my associate producer, Eric Estrada, and Casey Nance at Citron Studios, along with the wonderful crew at the San Francisco Public Press and KSFP. Voices of the Community is a member of Intersection for the Arts, which allows us to offer you a tax deduction for your contributions. Please go to georgecoster.com and click on the donate link to make a donation to help us provide future shows just like this one. While you're on our website, you can enjoy our archived past shows, which feature community voices working on solutions to critical issues facing Northern California communities. And you can sign up for our newsletter to find out more about future shows, as well as shows and events from the organizations that are included in our episodes. Take us along on your next COVID walk by subscribing to Voices of the Community on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at George Coster, and we'd love to hear from you with feedback and show ideas, so send us an email to george@georgecoster.com. I'm George Coster in San Francisco, and thank you for listening.